All right, ladies and gentlemen, so let's go ahead and pick up with where we left off yesterday. So we have right here Sergeant Major Morris coming to visit. We have this nice family evening, and then it starts to play out where the characters, maybe they aren't as happy as we thought they were. You have their adult son who's living at home. You have the wife who's constantly picking on the husband. And you have this son who, is not necessarily unhappy. He seems to have a great relationship with his mom. However, he may not have such a great relationship with his father. So anyhow, nobody believes Sergeant Major Morris. They're not exactly, excited about, him being there until he starts talking about this monkey's paw. So he has this little paw. Ew, it's real. It's the first thing I thought. Mr. White thinks that India is this fun place. However, Sergeant Major Morris, he's been at war. So we have to beg to differ. So then we come to the top of 12. And we have the mummified paw. It's from India. It has a spell that has been placed on it. So it's magical. And, he tells the story really well. He's very convincing. So everyone is a captive audience. So we find out that it gives 3 wishes. And, they ask, has anyone wished on it? And he kind of foretells the ending because he's like, yeah. So I don't know what the first 2 were, but when he got to the last one, he wished for death. And so, everybody's quiet. His tones were so grave. He was so serious. That a hush fell upon the group. So if you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man at last. Why do you keep it for? Fancy, I suppose. He likes it. He likes keeping a mummified paw in his pocket. Obviously, it's a conversation piece. He does mention very elusively that he's been, thinking about selling it. And, it's a naughty little paw. Obviously, it's evil. The last guy wished for death because it was, such a horrible thing to have. And, Mr. White, this is all of your evidence. Mr. White wants the paw. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody told me that something was bad luck, I'm sorry, it would be the last thing that I'd want in my home. But, Mr. White keeps on asking all of these questions, and we know that he's fairly interested in this paw. And over here, again, just like, going to India, Sergeant Major Morris, he takes the paw and he throws it on the fire. Now, White, he screams, ah, and he goes and he grabs it out of the fire. And it's just like India. Sergeant Major Morris, just like he said, I wouldn't wish India upon you when Mr. White said that he wanted to go. Here he says, better let it burn. Don't take it. Solemnly, he's very serious about this. I'm still wondering, does he sell it, right? So he tells him, throw it in the fire again. So pitch it in the fire like a sensible person. Be sensible, Is Mr. White sensible? I bet his wife would beg to differ. And that's where we go with the rest of the story. So he gives him the directions. This is how you wish for it. And then we come to this part right here. And the 3 sat. Oh, before we move on, let me go back. This highlighted portion right here. So it's a very holy man. So he wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. So automatically, we have this idea of fate that comes up. Remember, Mr. White may not be exactly happy with his life, may be a little bored. So the soldier tells his stories, and then, you fast forward, and all of a sudden he's leaving. It's real fast. They don't tell you anything else that had happened, I do want to remind you that, prior to the story, how many glasses of whiskey did Sergeant Major Morris drink? So that's something to remember. And, they had a second installment of the Soldier's Adventures in India. So, they're well into the night. That just something to think about. So Herbert shuts the door, said Herbert. And we know he said this too because it's in the same paragraph and it doesn't tell you anyone else has spoken, so it has to be him. We shan't make much out of it. So Herbert is a pretty logical guy. Scoot this over so you can see it. And he... Oh, sorry, guys. The next time I do one of these recordings, I'll make sure to take out all of this stuff over here from the camera. Anyhow, so Herbert's a pretty logical guy. So, he obviously, he doesn't necessarily believe that the stories are true. He's living in a different day and age. He is obviously not in the military himself. So the first thing that Mrs. White asks is, did you give him anything for it, Father? They call one another father and mother. And he says a trifle, which a trifle means a small amount. And then he colors slightly. And don't you love the British spelling of coloring? In the United States, we don't add that extra U. It's very Britishy. So we know when he colors, he blushes. That's what it means. He turns pink. And something is up. And that, if he says a small amount and he colors slightly, the inference here is that he probably paid more than a trifle. So that's, reading between the lines, something that, we have to understand. So Herbert doesn't believe his stories. Anyhow, Herbert, hears this, and he's probably fairly annoyed with his father because, well, you were there when they were playing chess, so you can kind of imagine how he feels. So anyhow, he's sitting there listening, and he's just obviously thinks this situation is ridiculous. Pretended horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, Father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked. Remember, Mrs. White constantly nags her husband. When a woman constantly nags her husband, it was called henpecking. And so this reveals to us a little bit about Herbert's character. Part 1 tells you a lot about Mr. White, and then you get to understand, Herbert for the short time he's with us, and you get a little bit of information about Mrs. White. He's very sarcastic. And then something else that you find out about Mrs. White and Herbert is right here, he darts around the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. What language are they speaking? High English. They're speaking High English. So, maligned Mrs. White. So she's like, oh, Herbert, you silly little thing. And so she's chasing him and she's going to hit him with a doily. And when I say doily, antimacassar, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. So I have to go to Dr. Google and I'm going to pull up, it's a piece of cloth, whatever. Here they are. So people hand make these. They're knit. They're very intricately, made. I wish somebody would have shown me how to do this. It's one of those, dying arts. I'm thinking back to the celebration of grandfathers. Elders, this is something that would have been passed down from your elders. So if you think about it, do you know someone who's older? Or maybe it's, someone who's younger that, has these things in their home. This is a very special craft to be able to make. And so anyhow, you have the antimacassar. They'd put them on the arms. They'd put them on the back of the chair. And the reason for that was your hands are super dirty. Now, this is a dark brown chair. I have a dark brown chair at my house. It's the only one that I allow my dogs to sit in because sometimes they're like humans and I let them sit in chairs. But I have another chair and it's a very light beigey tan color. And on the edges, on this part, it always gets dirty. And so it's microfiber, meaning that I can just, grab a cloth and I can wash it off. But back in the day, furniture wasn't as easily cleaned and they would put you could throw these in the washer and wash them. So when somebody sat there, your hands are so crazy dirty. And, even when you wash them, because you're constantly touching things, that when somebody sat in the chair, it would, make it where they didn't leave marks. And would be from your hair oils. You wouldn't want to, make the back of the chair gross. So antimacassar, so she grabs this and you can kind of picture, Herbert, and she chases him around. So again, back to the story. Herbert and Mrs. White have a really good relationship. I don't necessarily feel that he has a bad relationship with Mr. White, but that chess game, it lingers in my head. It's such a weird situation. So something else I wanted to point out is with Mrs. White, henpecking her husband, her character is a pattern that you're going to see again and again in literature. And when we have patterns in literature, we call them motifs. So we've talked about themes, and something else that we discuss is motifs, these patterns. And the wife, she's a total pattern. Now, remember, it's 1902. Women can't vote. It's a very long time until women can vote. And Mrs. White is this character who she's seen as very, maybe very controlling in a way. And she's not very nice to her husband. I feel like today when you look at moms on TV, we have a different, view of women in modern ages. And so you have a more, kind, and loving women, I don't know. Maybe we do have, as much of that henpecking, motif, but the way that her character is built, I couldn't, help but think that the year had something to do with people being, readily accepting of the way that the author builds her character. So when we go over here, Mr. White, he took that paw and, he probably paid like a ton for it. We'll find out actually in part 2. If you snooze, you miss it in part 2, but it tells you how much he pays. And so it seems to me I've got all I want. Yeah, you're super happy with that chess game. And so he says that, but again, you never trust the narrator. You have to go with the facts. The narrator is going to tell you what they want. Now, at the beginning of the story, you saw that he wasn't exactly happy. I mean, remember how he got really upset when his son beat him, and he's like waiting for his friend. And then when his friend gets there, he's like, "Well, I wish I could have gone to war." Oh, you wish you could have gone to war instead of, having a family? So you don't necessarily trust what the narrator tells you. You have to learn to make decisions about characters yourself. And so if you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for 200 pounds then. That'll just do it. And so again, Herbert lives at home and he's like, wish for 200 pounds. They use euros now, but a long time ago in England, they don't have dollars. They would have used pounds. And so Herbert's being sarcastic. And we know that Herbert's older. He lives at home. Let's go ahead and stop and look at what we know about Herbert. So what have we learned about Herbert's character? So he likes to joke. He also thinks his father isn't very smart. He's very logical and isn't easily convinced. We know he's logical because he's a really good chess player. He takes his time. He watches. He's able to kind of beat his father. He doesn't believe. We know he's logical. Chess game. And he doesn't believe the soldier. And he's totally sarcastic. He likes to joke. He's a joker. Kind of has a dry sense of humor in a way. Now, with that being said, you have that, typical scary movie setting that continues throughout, and we'll visit that. So I wish for 200 pounds. Yeah, he totally did it. His son told him he wishes for 200 pounds. I mean, he didn't think that out very well. And the joke about it is 200 pounds probably would be like, oh, he wishes for like $2,000. I think that would be about the equivalent. Not a lot of money when it comes down to it. When you start working, you'll understand what I mean by that. So not a lot of money, but, that's what he wastes one of his wishes on. And Herbert, a fine crash from the piano greeted the words. So Herbert, makes a sound like dun, 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 probably on the piano. And Mr. White cries. And the wife and son ran towards him. And he's like, it moved. with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake. I can't help thinking he's been drinking. Before Mr. Sergeant Major Morris told his second half of stories, he'd already had 3 glasses of whiskey. That's just, Sergeant Major Morris. Mr. White, I imagine, is, keeping up with him and doing the same. And so, again, don't trust your narrator. He's telling you that, oh no, he really saw this. Remember, they've been drinking whiskey. So Herbert, well, I don't see the money. And I bet I never shall. He still doesn't believe. So it must have been your fancy, father, said the wife, regarding him anxiously. Fancy, old way of saying imagination. We don't really use that term anymore, but if you ever hear it, usually that's what they're referring to. Now, father and son, they sit down, they finish their pipes. Okay, it's tobacco, because the Surgeon General had not given his warning, and people didn't realize that, smoking was, tobacco was carcinogenic, and it caused cancer. And so, we have drinking, we have smoking. Wow, I don't think the guy who wrote this intended this story for children. However, it's good thinking practice, so we'll continue with it. So anyhow, a silence unusual and depressing settled upon all 3, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire. So there's are they happy? I mean, yes, there's the paw, but there was this feeling of unhappiness that, started with that chess game. And again, he's, hinting to you, that they just an unusual and depressing, silence. So typical scary movie setting. So outside, the wind was higher than ever. The old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. The wind's, blown quite a bit, so that kind of explains that. But again, there's that unhappiness. So here's our sarcastic little Herbert, and he tells his dad, so, all right, I guess I'll make a joke. Everybody's kind of, depressing, so I'm going to break up the mood. So I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. So I don't know about you, but the first thing that I pictured was, people used to put these on their houses years ago because they believed that they would, ward off evil spirits. And so, something like that. Yeah. It's exactly what Herbert's thinking. And he's making a joke. Obviously he doesn't believe that the paw's going to do anything. Now Mr. White sits alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. Okay, fancy language again. The last face was so horrible and so simian. It's a fancy way of saying just he saw monkey faces in the fire. Is Mr. White a reliable source? Narrators shouldn't always be trusted. Now, Mr. White isn't the narrator, but what we have in this story is a third person, omniscient narrator. Stay tuned for the Cornell notes on this. We'll be adding those in another video. The person who's telling you the story obviously is not in the story, but he knows these people really well. He can tell you their exact thoughts. That's what omniscient means. They know everything. But again, you don't trust what you're told. You have to go with the facts. So with that being said, we're going to move on to part 2. And that is it. And my first installment of part 1.